You can always tell when a currency is dying, not from the headlines, not from the speeches, not even from the markets. Currencies don't collapse the way movies show them, with riots, chaos, and burning paper in the streets. No, real collapse is quiet, silent, almost polite. It begins with a feeling, a hesitation, a slight doubt that spreads through the system like a cold draft in an old house. You see it when investors start asking questions they never used to ask. You see it when foreign governments begin making deals in anything but dollars. You see it when ordinary people, the ones who never cared about monetary policy, suddenly notice that their money buys a little less, and then less again. Most people don't recognize these signs, but I've spent my life watching currencies rise and fall, and I've learned that the first stage of collapse isn't chaos, it's complacency. A nation reaches too far, spends too much, borrows against a future that isn't guaranteed, and convinces itself that because its currency has ruled the world for so long, it will rule forever. Reserve currency status becomes a comfort blanket, a shield against accountability, a myth repeated so often that people stop questioning it. But every empire that believed its currency was immortal eventually learned the same lesson. The world only trusts your money as long as it trusts your discipline, and discipline is the first thing great nations lose. The signs have been building for years. Debt climbing faster than growth. Budgets built on fantasy instead of arithmetic, political cycles that reward spending and punish restraint, interest payments swelling into a beast no one can control. But the real warning, the one almost no one paid attention to, was when other nations began quietly stepping away from the dollar, not with announcements, not with declarations, but with behavior. Oil contracts priced in other currencies. Trade agreements bypassing the Federal Reserve entirely. Gold purchases rising to levels we haven't seen in decades. When the world starts hoarding gold, it's not because they want shiny metal, it's because they no longer trust promises. The truth is, the dollar didn't fall, it drifted slowly, silently, and as the world realized, the United States was spending more than it could ever repay. A currency doesn't die when it loses value, it dies when it loses faith. And faith dies quietly, one transaction at a time. Most people won't notice the shift until it's too late, until the cost of living jumps faster than their wages, until interest rates spike to defend a weakening currency, until the dollar, the symbol of global power, becomes just another flag in a crowded marketplace, because that's how reserve currencies end. Not with a bang, but with a whisper, and a world that slowly stops listening. And right now, that whisper is getting louder. It didn't happen overnight. The world didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon the dollar. There was no announcement, no global summit, no historic declaration. Instead, it happened the way most monumental shifts do. Quietly, gradually, beneath the noise of everyday headlines. You can trace the beginning of it back to a simple realization shared by nations across every continent. The United States was no longer exporting stability, it was exporting risk, decades of debt, endless political deadlock, financial promises built on sand instead of steel, a currency backed more by habit than by discipline. And slowly, the rest of the world began to ask a question they had never asked before. Why must we rely on a system we cannot control? At first, it was small, a single oil contract priced in another currency, a trade agreement between two countries that bypassed the dollar, a bilateral deal settled in local money instead of the greenback. These were dismissed as isolated decisions, strategic experiments, nothing that threatened the global order. But I've lived long enough to know that history turns not on dramatic moments, but on the small, subtle ones everyone ignores. The truth is, the world didn't turn away from the dollar because they hated America. They turned away because they hated uncertainty. A nation that once stood as the bedrock of financial integrity began to resemble a gambler, borrowing more, spending more, and reassuring everyone that the debt would somehow, someday, magically pay for itself. Foreign governments saw the numbers before the public did. They saw the deficits. They saw the interest payments climbing like a rising tide. They saw the political incentives leaning toward more spending, not less. And they drew the only conclusion they could. A system headed toward imbalance cannot remain the world's anchor, so they began hedging. India started settling oil purchases in other currencies. China expanded its alternative payment networks. Singapore, Brazil, South Africa, nations that once depended on the dollar, started diversifying reserves for the first time in decades. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. Because when a global currency weakens, the collapse doesn't start in America. It starts everywhere else. Countries that depended on dollar lending began choking under the weight of rising exchange rates. Nations that saved in dollars saw their purchasing power erode. Economies tied to U.S. interest cycles felt the squeeze of volatility they didn't create. So they walked away. Not in anger, but in calculation, not in protest, but in preparation. And that's the part no one is prepared for. People assume the dollar's collapse would be an American crisis, but the world won't wait for America to fix its problems. They'll adapt, evolve, and create new systems. They'll trade with each other. They'll diversify. They'll hedge their future before the U.S. hedges its own. And by the time the American public realizes what happened, it won't be a global system depending on the dollar. It will be a dollar depending on a global system that no longer needs it. That's how reserve currencies fall, quietly, gradually, and then all at once. By the time the world began turning its back on the dollar, the warning signs were already written across the American economy, clear enough for anyone willing to look, terrifying enough for most to ignore. A reserve currency doesn't collapse because of one decision or one administration or one crisis. It collapses because of accumulated neglect. Tiny fractures spreading across a foundation that everyone assumed was unbreakable. Those fractures are visible now. You can see them in every corner of the system. You see them in the national debt, climbing faster than the country can even pretend to control. Every year the gap grows wider, and every year the promises become bigger and emptier. You see them in the interest payments, the silent monster swallowing the federal budget piece by piece. A nation once known for building highways, bridges, and industries now spends more servicing old debt than investing in its own future. You see them in inflation, which officials once called temporary, the same way a doctor calls a terminal illness manageable. The cost of everything rises, but the value of nothing. Does families feel it at the grocery store? Businesses feel it in payroll. Retirees feel it in their savings. And still the system insists everything is fine. But I learned a long time ago, if you want to understand a nation's future, stop listening to its leaders and start watching its behavior, and the behavior now. It's panicked, quietly panicked. Banks tightening credit. Corporations hoarding cash. Wealthy investors quietly moving their assets overseas. Even allies, not adversaries, allies reducing their exposure to U.S. debt. These aren't the signs of confidence. These are the signs of preparation. Preparation for a shift that has happened many times before. The moment when a global power realizes it is no longer the center of gravity, but the one orbiting a new reality. That's how every currency empire falls, not because it wants to, but because it refuses to believe it can. America, once dominated by production, by innovation, by the strength of its middle class. But what dominates now? Debt, deficit, division, a political system that treats long-term responsibility as optional and short-term wins as destiny. And here's the truth most fear to speak aloud. A currency doesn't collapse when people stop using it. It collapses when people stop respecting it. Respect is earned through discipline. And discipline is the first thing great nations lose when they confuse prosperity with permission. I've watched this pattern in countries across the world. From Latin America to Europe to Asia, every time the story is identical. A nation grows powerful. Its currency becomes king. It believes the rules don't apply to it. It prints, it spends, it borrows, it denies, and then it breaks. The United States is not broken yet, not by a long shot, but the cracks are spreading faster than anyone is willing to admit. And the most dangerous moment for any empire is not when it collapses, but when it refuses to believe that it can. A currency doesn't die when the world stops using it. It dies when the nation behind it finally realizes it has run out of time. And that moment is never loud. It doesn't come with alarms. It doesn't come with warnings. It doesn't come with a date circled on the calendar. It comes instead with a quiet shift. An almost imperceptible change in the way the world responds. The United States has felt invincible for so long that it's forgotten the oldest law of power. Credibility is more valuable than money once lost. It cannot be bought back. And right now, America's credibility is bleeding, not because of any one leader or any one policy, but because the nation has convinced itself that it can build prosperity while ignoring the very principles prosperity requires. You see it in the budgets that don't balance. You see it in the debts that don't shrink. You see it in the promises that don't match the math. You see it in the way every problem is answered with more spending, more debt, more denial. But no empire has ever borrowed its way into stability, not one. Because eventually the world stops lending and starts watching. That's the moment we're approaching now. The point where the rest of the world is no longer waiting for America to lead, but preparing for the moment it can't. The quiet shift is already here. Countries settling trade without the dollar, nations building alliances outside U.S. influence, foreign banks reducing dollar reserves not for strategy but for survival. The world is not punishing America. It is protecting itself from America's imbalance. That is the great irony of history. Collapse doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the indifference of friends. And when that indifference reaches a critical mass, the system begins to move on with or without the nation that once anchored it. So what happens next? It won't be a dramatic crash. It won't be a single event. It will be a long, grinding correction, a painful recalibration of expectations. Inflation will remain stubborn because trust is expensive to rebuild. Interest rates will stay high because lenders demand security when belief fades. The cost of living will rise, not because of greed, but because the dollar will no longer carry the weight it once did. And through it all, the public will search for someone to blame. But blame is pointless. What matters is the lesson. A currency is not strong because it is printed in a powerful nation. It is strong because the world believes that nation is responsible. That belief is the true reserve currency. And right now, that reserve is running dry. But here's the truth the history books often forget. Collapse is not an ending, it is a correction, a reminder, a recalibration of reality after too many years of illusion. And after every correction, there comes a moment when a nation must decide who it wants to be next, whether the United States returns to discipline, rebuilds trust, and learns from the arrogance of its own prosperity. That choice has not yet been made. But make no mistake, The world is watching. The clock is ticking. And the dollar, once the symbol of unshakable power, is now whispering a warning to anyone who can hear it. Faith is fading. Balance must return, or the system will do it for us. Because in the end, money is not paper. Money is not numbers. Money is not policy. Money is trust. And trust is the only currency the world cannot afford to lose.